Cassius was with me for 3 years just to spite his first love. Relying on the fact that I liked him and wouldn't leave him, he trampled on me wantonly to amuse his first love. Later, I was diagnosed with ALS. I let him go. But he thought I was just making a fuss. It wasn't until later, when he never saw me again, that he started to search for me like crazy. I was with Cassius for 3 years, but the reason for being together was quite ridiculous. That day, I just got back to the dormitory after doing a part-time job. It was snowing heavily. I saw him talking to another girl. I couldn't hear very clearly. I only heard him say, "Don't you need money? Here's 100,000 yuan. Will you be with me?" He handed the girl a bank card. The girl threw the card back in his face. "Although my family is poor, I won't allow you to insult me either." I looked at the girl's shoes. She was wearing Nike. Then I looked at mine. They had holes in them after being worn for several years, but I still hadn't thrown them away. Perhaps my gaze was too intense. Cassius and I made eye contact. Cassius was also proud. Immediately, he walked towards me with the card and said, "There's 100,000 yuan on this card. Be my girlfriend." Any sensible person wouldn't have taken it. But I was not only short of money but also liked him. So I took it and said, "Okay." After saying that, both Cassius and the girl were stunned. The girl even had tears in her eyes and said, "Cassius, just because you have some stinking money, do you have to humiliate me like this?" With that, she covered her face and ran away. Cassius was about to chase after her. I grabbed his hand and looked at him and said, "I've liked you for a long time, Cassius. My name is Serafina. I'm a freshman in the business school. Can you try to like me?" Later, I learned that the woman was called Astria. Cassius had liked her throughout high school. They all said that Cassius was head over heels for her. It was hard to imagine that Cassius would be with me. Facing such remarks, I just smiled. I knew that Cassius didn't like me, but I always believed that where there's a will, there's a way. No matter it was windy or rainy, I would wait for him downstairs in his dormitory, run errands for him, deliver meals to him, and carry him to the hospital on my back when he had a fever in the middle of winter. I thought that even a stone should be warmed up by now. Later, my mother called me and said that the family was really struggling to make ends meet and my father's condition had worsened again. She asked me to figure out a way to get living expenses on my own. In the past, I had always given up the poverty-stricken student quota to others. But this year, with this situation, I couldn't give it up. I got a certificate from the hospital and got the poverty stamp from the village to prove that I was truly poor. Given my situation, others, remembering my usual kindness, didn't compete with me for it, but later, Cassius sent me a message asking me to meet him. I deliberately changed into clothes that looked relatively normal. Since I didn't have a proper coat, I simply didn't wear one. Outside, the wind and snow made me shiver. I just put on some clothes that looked relatively normal. Since I didn't have a proper coat, I simply didn't wear one. Outside, the wind and snow made me shiver. I was just about to greet Cassius when I saw that his expression wasn't good. I asked cautiously, "What's wrong?" He looked at me impatiently and said, "Did you snatch Astria's poverty-stricken student quota?" Snatch? The poverty-stricken student quota is awarded through evaluation, not hers. My lips had already turned slightly purple from the cold. "You?" Cassius was a bit impatient. "Are you poor?" I tried to reason with Cassius. "Cassius, Cassius interrupted me and said, "You give the quota back to her. The list is with my uncle now. I've changed it to Astria. Don't you have the 100,000 yuan I gave you?" Then he gave me a sideways glance. "Anyway, it should be enough for you to squander, right? Astria is different from you. Although her family is not well off, she refuses to accept handouts. Only this poverty subsidy. Don't snatch everything from her." But I remembered that Astria hadn't competed for it before. My lips trembled as I lowered my eyes and asked, "Why is it especially this year?" Cassius said, "Because I signed her up for it." Only then did I realize that she was living even worse than I thought. "She's different from you." I lowered my head and coughed twice. Cassius put his coat on me and said, "Knowing it's cold outside, why didn't you wear a coat?" Serafina, put away your little thoughts. I don't like them. I wrapped the coat Cassius gave me around me and said, but Cassius, those coats were too shabby to be seen by you. Cassius frowned and said in a cold tone, for the sake of your running errands, I won't let you live too badly. Is 2,000 yuan enough? If not, there's more. But don't expect too much. Later, I lost the poverty-stricken student quota. I also gave all the 100,000 yuan to the hospital, and my life was worse than a dog's. Cassius got drunk, and his roommate called me to pick him up. I found their box. There were people in the room, some smoking, some drinking, and even the table was full of money. Cassius waved to me, come here. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I still walked over. Yo, Cassius, I admit defeat wholeheartedly. I didn't expect that she would really come to pick you up in such heavy snow. My face was a bit embarrassed. Cassius immediately stuffed the 1,000 yuan handed to him by that person into my pocket and said, aren't you short of money? I didn't treat you badly for this trip, huh? Here's your hard-earned money. As soon as these words were spoken, the whole room instantly became quiet. I looked at Cassius with the same look he gave to gold diggers, and my already cold body became even colder. Even more terrifying was that the people in the private room immediately changed their looks and even said in front of me, it seems that Cassius still misses that little hot pepper from before. Speaking of her, I just remembered that I just made a couple of teasing remarks, and Cassius beat me into the hospital. Little sister, you're short of money. Then why don't you stop following Cassius? He has someone he likes. Why don't you follow me instead? I don't have anything else but plenty of money. He looked at Cassius and, seeing that Cassius didn't stop him, became even happier. As long as you're good in bed, money is not a problem. Come on, drink this bottle of wine and I'll give you 10,000 yuan. My face turned pale. Cassius beat someone into the hospital for Astria, but he was indifferent when I was humiliated. Yes, I had no self-esteem. So I stopped looking at Cassius, picked up the bottle of wine on the table. I had never drunk wine before, but that time, I drank it desperately, and the laughter echoed in my ears. Cassius frowned, his well-defined hand gripping the bottle, and his cold words were like a basin of cold water poured on my head. Have you had enough? Are you really risking your life for this little money? I shook off his hand, lowered my eyes and said softly, Cassius, if I die, you must be the happiest one, right? I gently placed the wine bottle on the table. After all, if it broke, I might have to pay for it. I looked at that person. Even though I could hardly stand steadily, I still reached out my hand to him. I finished drinking. Give me the money. That person's face was embarrassed, but a person who had been silent all along laughed out loud. Interesting, interesting. It's worth running so far to attend such a boring party. I hadn't noticed this person before. He was sitting in the farthest corner, his eyes watching me like a wild beast. Cassius had a sullen face and held me tightly in his arms, his movements rough and possessive. Phoenix, she is my girlfriend. That was the first time I heard Cassius admit to others that I was his girlfriend. Phoenix leaned on the sofa and looked at Cassius and said faintly, who knows in the future? I don't know how I got out. When I woke up, my head was splitting. Cassius was sitting in front of the bed. He was awakened by my movement of getting up. Then, he silently handed me a bottle of milk and turned his head to ask, headache? I shook my head. The clean room and the comfortable and soft bed made me realize that I might be in Cassius's house. I still remembered that Cassius said he hated me touching his things. I quickly got out of bed, put on a coat and ran outside. Cassius frowned behind me and asked, why are you running? I stopped at the entrance and turned to look at him, saying nervously, I'm afraid of dirtying your house. Cassius was stunned, and I walked out after putting on my shoes. Later, the news of my staying out overnight somehow reached Astria's ears. Astria, who hadn't looked for me in 3 years, came to find me the next day. She looked at me and said, do you think Cassius likes you? I didn't detect the arrogant tone in her words. Remembering Cassius's behavior, I still said stubbornly, he will like me. Why? Cassius hates girls like you who are after money. I looked at her and said very seriously, I'm not after money. And I also know that you're not really poor. Astria's face was a bit embarrassed, stubborn. Then she smiled provocatively and said, "Then let's see whether he cares about you or me." Her eyes were full of confidence and certainty. And I just didn't believe it. A few days later, Cassius said he wanted to go on a date with me. But I had a high fever that day. However, since it was the first time Cassius had asked me out, I still forced myself to go. I was so nervous that I didn't even know how to use the knife and fork. I asked a bit awkwardly, "Why did you suddenly think of asking me out?" Cassius looked up and said faintly, "You're my girlfriend. Isn't it normal to go on a date?" Cassius's sudden closeness caught me off guard, and I even felt that it was just a dream. If it was a dream, I hope I would never wake up. There was an argument coming from the next room. It seemed that a waiter had spilled red wine on a customer. Cassius suddenly stood up. I asked him, "What's wrong?" He said he was going out for a moment and patted my head. My already hot cheeks became even hotter. I waited and waited, but Cassius never came back. So I went out to look for him. At a corner, I saw Astria leaning in Cassius's arms. Our eyes met, and she smiled at me. She was wearing a waiter's uniform. So she was the waiter who had caused the trouble, and Cassius had seen her long ago. Cassius was gently wiping her tears. I leaned against the cold wall. I didn't have the courage to question Cassius. I stood outside the Western restaurant, thinking that I would never come here again. Just as I was about to leave, my left foot suddenly wouldn't listen to me, and my vision became blurred. When I was conscious again, there was no one in the ward. Over the years, I had never dared to get sick, and if I did, I always endured it by myself. I pulled out the needle on the back of my hand and fled this place in a panic. Along the way, I almost knocked over a nurse's cart. The nurse stopped me. I thought the nurse was asking me for money, so I grabbed her hand and smiled weakly. "Sister, I've only had less than 1/3 of that bottle of infusion. Can you charge me for only 1/3 of it?" I knew it was absurd and embarrassing. But compared to having no money, what was embarrassment? But the nurse frowned, looking completely disagreeing and a bit cautious as she said, "Student, do you know that you have ALS? You can't be discharged now." ALS? I know about amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. Different parts of the body will gradually become stiff and fail one by one, and then I'll die. But the first thing that came to my mind wasn't that I would die, but that this disease must cost a lot of money. The nurse looked at me with sympathy all over her face and patted me on the shoulder. "Student, don't lose hope. The doctors will do their best." The nurse left. I stood there in a daze, but the noise just now still attracted many people. At this moment, a slender hand with distinct knuckles grabbed my arm. I turned my head and saw Cassius's familiar face. He frowned, impatience in his voice. "Serafina, have you had enough of this?" Right after that, Astria's voice came from behind. "Cassius, I'm leaving. The medical expenses here are too high. I can't afford the treatment." Cassius immediately let go of my hand and said anxiously, "You got your foot injured because of Serafina. For both emotional and rational reasons, I can't let you leave now." "Because of me?" Cassius looked at me. "Serafina, if Astria hadn't found you lying in the snow, your life would have been in danger. Don't you think you should say thank you? She fell down the stairs trying to save you. You should pay for your willfulness, thank you?" Astria smiled at me. "We're classmates in the same department. You're welcome." Listening to them going back and forth like this, I suddenly felt really bored. I took out a handful of loose change from my shabby coat and handed it to Astria, saying, "This is all I have on me. Or do you want my life? Don't be a good person next time. Every time you do, I get hurt." Cassius was furious. The grip on my hand gradually tightened as he gritted his teeth and said, "Serafina." Astria folded the money one by one and handed it back to me, saying, "I don't need you to insult me. I have nothing to do with Cassius. If there were anything between us, it would never have been your turn. I'll earn my medical expenses by working part-time myself. You're right. Being kind is my business, and whether you accept it or not is yours." "Heh, kindness?" I was just about to say something. Cassius blocked me and said to Astria, "Serafina will pay this money." I looked at Cassius in disbelief. "Cassius, who gave you the right to make decisions for me?" I pulled out my hand that was being held by Cassius, looking desolate. Seeing this, Cassius looked a bit flustered and wanted to hold me again. I used to be so eager to touch Cassius. But now, I took a step back on my own initiative and said softly, Cassius, it's been 3 years. Can I let you go? Consider the 100,000 yuan as the price for me licking your boots for 3 years. Cassius's hand froze. Serafina, don't be silly. I smiled and said, if I could make a scene, I'd just like to slap you. Cassius frowned deeply, grabbed my wrist with considerable force, and said viciously, you're not worth the 100,000 yuan for these 3 years. I fell silent. So, in Cassius's eyes, the 3 years I spent chasing after him weren't even worth 100,000 yuan. I broke free from Cassius, smiled, and said, since you've said that, I'm not that cheap either. I'll pay you back the 100,000 yuan. I turned around and left. Cassius took a step forward, looking as if he wanted to hold me back. But Astria was pulling on his sleeve behind him, saying, Cassius, I know why you were with Serafina, to make me jealous, right? I know Serafina isn't your type. Cassius stopped in his tracks. I sneered and didn't hesitate anymore. I walked quickly. I thought that if I cried in front of those two people, it would be so undignified. The next second, I wasn't paying attention and bumped into a doctor. He was tall. I bumped into his chest and saw the pen hanging on his chest. I looked up and it was Phoenix, the man I met that night. His wild eyes were covered by a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, making him look a bit more proper than that day. He raised an eyebrow at me and said, Yo, an acquaintance. Before he finished speaking, Astria had already let go of Cassius's hand. She walked quickly over and then stopped a few meters away. Phoenix. Phoenix put one hand on my shoulder and smiled. There are quite a few acquaintances today. Astria's face looked really bad, and so did Cassius's. Anyone could tell that there was a story among the three of them. Cassius, with a dark face, said to me, Serafina, come here. But Phoenix tightened his grip on my shoulder. Astria forced a smile and asked, Phoenix, where have you been all these years? That day, it wasn't what you thought between me and Cassius. He was drunk. As she spoke, tears welled up in Astria's eyes. I didn't want to hear about the love and hate among the three of them at all. But I more or less understood what was going on. I'm just a poor girl. Phoenix and Cassius, just by looking at their clothes, are clearly from a different class than me. Astria is the apple of their eye. Why should I get involved in this mess? I should have figured it out long ago. I took Phoenix's hand off my shoulder. Without saying a word, I hung my head and walked towards the hospital exit. When I passed by a mirror, I saw my current wretched appearance. My face and lips were as white as paper, without a trace of blood. So pitiful. After what happened that day, I went home to see my parents. I didn't tell them that I had ALS. The family was already having a hard time, and I was afraid they couldn't bear it. The family wasn't well off to begin with. When I was in high school, my father fell seriously ill and lost his ability to work. Only my mother was left to work 2 jobs to support me and my father. I looked at my once energetic father being tortured by the illness until he was neither human nor ghost, and my heart felt choked. My father was sober for a while and sent my mother out. He said, Daughter, could you buy me a bottle of sleeping pills? If I'm gone, don't let your mother be too sad. She's still young. Let her find a good man. My father's tone was almost pleading. Tears had already welled up in my eyes without my knowing. My father loved me and my mother. But my mother and I also loved my father. I shook my head. Dad, I'm almost graduating. I'll be able to make money soon. You know, I'm in a good school. Once I graduate, I can make a lot of money. Then you and Mom can live a good life. My father closed his eyes, and just one tear slipped from the corner of his eye. I didn't say anything else. After I came back, I took on several part-time jobs, working almost non-stop without a break. When I went out to work part-time in the evening, I ran into Cassius and his friends on the basketball court. Usually, Cassius always disliked this basketball court. I don't know why he came today. He and his friends were playing basketball and didn't seem to notice me. Good. I lowered my eyes and quickened my pace. Just then, a gust of strong wind blew. I looked up and saw a basketball flying straight at me. I instinctively wanted to dodge, but my left leg started to go numb again. The basketball hit me hard on the corner of my mouth. The smell of blood spread, and a stream of hot blood flowed from the corner of my mouth. I looked at those guys. His friends all had gloating expressions on their faces, and his hand froze in the air. They did it on purpose, maybe to vent their anger for Cassius. I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth and lowered my head again, limping away, but Cassius ran over and grabbed my hand. I turned my head to look at him without saying a word. He looked into my eyes for a long time and finally slowly let go of my hand. Serafina, you're injured. He took out a piece of paper and reached out his hand. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Astrea coming this way with 2 bottles of water in her arms. She should be coming to look for Cassius. I took a step back, turned around, and limped away faster. I really looked a bit wretched in the eyes of others. Cassius's friend came over and poked him, teasing, "Hey, Astrea's here. Congratulations on winning the beauty's heart. Serafina is not only a gold digger but also dared to dump you. It's so funny to see her limping." Cassius was silent for a while before asking, "Did you guys hurt her foot?" "No, we just hit her with a basketball." "Isn't this to vent your anger for you, Cassius? As for her leg, maybe it's karma." I stopped in my steps. I picked up the basketball that had rolled to my feet and threw it hard at the person who was talking, my tone a bit cold. "If we're talking about karma, you'll be the first to get it." Seemingly not used to seeing me being so tough, that person was stunned for a moment. Funny enough, I deliberately avoided them, but today I ran into all the people I didn't want to meet. Not only Cassius and Astrea, but also Phoenix, who was blocking my way right in front of me. I pretended not to see him and walked past him. Wherever I walked, Phoenix followed. So he was deliberately blocking my way. I stopped and looked up at him. "Phoenix, if I remember correctly, we've only met twice. Did I offend you somewhere? Or do you also want to vent your anger for Cassius?" Phoenix raised his hand and rubbed his thumb over my injured corner of the mouth, his voice a bit hoarse. "What if I do want to vent my anger for him?" I turned my head away and grabbed his wrist, looking straight into his eyes. "It's less than 200 meters from here to the police station. If you want to go in and have tea, I won't stop you." Phoenix was slightly stunned, and then there was a smile in his eyes. "I thought you'd come up to me to let me vent my anger. I'm not that cheap. Whether it's Cassius or Phoenix, they all just treat me like a little toy in the end. Why did I fall in love with Cassius in the first place? Maybe because I had been living in the dark for so long that I mistook the light for the sun. Cassius and I are from 2 completely different worlds. He's confident, has many friends, and is outgoing. The moment he smiled, it seemed like I was healed. Unfortunately, he never really smiled at me. Anyway, I've tried. And this is how it turned out." Thinking of this, I gently asked Phoenix, "What do you want from me? Tell me." Phoenix didn't say anything until I finished my part-time job. He was still waiting outside. It was already past 11 o'clock, and there were only a few scattered people on the street. He was leaning against the railing, smoking a cigarette, looking even more accustomed to the night than I was. Seeing me come out, he stubbed out the cigarette in his hand and threw it into the trash can, then looked at his watch. "It's so late. Can you still get back to the dormitory?" "Yes. But I would just have to endure some sarcastic remarks from the dormitory supervisor. I'll give you a ride." Phoenix's car was parked nearby. Although I don't know much about cars, I can recognize the logo. I had seen Cassius's car once, and it had the same logo. I was silent for a while and then said, "Phoenix, what on earth do you want? Have you fallen in love with me after just 2 meetings? You're not that kind of person." Phoenix stopped in his tracks and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Then tell me what kind of person you think I am." I didn't move or reply. Phoenix opened the passenger door of the car, leaned against the car, and his eyes were the same as when I first saw him. It was as if he were a wild beast and I was the prey he had his eyes on. "Get in the car." Seeing that I didn't move for a long time, Phoenix smiled. "Why? Are you afraid that I'll eat you up? You've always wanted to know what I want to do. I'll tell you if you get in the car." I got into the car. The decorations inside the car were all very nice. A silver rabbit plaque was particularly conspicuous, because the style was old, and there was also an almost penetrating engraving on it. Seeing that I had been staring at it for a long time, Phoenix asked, "Do you like it?" I shook my head. In senior year of high school, everyone in the class had a good luck charm of their own Chinese zodiac sign, saying that it would bring good luck for the college entrance examination. My father promised to give me one on my birthday, but my father broke his promise, and on that day, he was diagnosed with a serious illness. I never mentioned it again. I looked out of the window. "Tell me what you want to do." "I want you to leave this place." Then he took out his phone and pulled up a screen. "You know this company, right? I've reserved an interview slot for you." Not only did I know it, but it was also a household name. Every student in the business school was vying to get into this company. Without connections, no matter how excellent you were, you wouldn't even be able to touch the threshold of the company. I turned off my phone and smiled. "Phoenix, you've put in a lot of effort, haven't you?" He didn't answer and continued, "And I'll pay part of your father's medical expenses. In exchange, you can't have any contact with anyone here after you leave, including your parents." Then he took out a new SIM card. "If you agree, take it." Was he trying to erase my traces here? However, the conditions were really good, so good that I couldn't refuse. I took the SIM card and said softly, "There's no need for the medical expenses. I got 30,000 yuan from drinking before, and it can last for a while. Once I enter the company, I'll earn the medical expenses for my father with my own ability. By the way, I still owe Cassius 100,000 yuan. Transfer it to your card when the time comes, and you can pay it back for me." The car slowly stopped downstairs in the dormitory. I opened the door and was about to get out. "Serafina." This was the first time Phoenix had called my name. I turned my head, waiting for him to continue. He was silent for a while and then said, "Take care of yourself. I love myself more than you think." I closed the car door and walked towards the entrance of the dormitory. When I was almost there, I was suddenly yanked over by someone, and a familiar voice full of anger said, "Where have you been so late?" I hit the cold wall, and the pain in my back made me frown. I looked up at Cassius. There was anger and dissatisfaction in his eyes, but there was no inquisitive doubt at all. He didn't care at all why I was back so late. I shook off Cassius's hand and said in a flat tone, "I went to do a part-time job." "A part-time job? Who are you kidding?" Cassius folded his arms, looking contemptuous. "How many times have you met Phoenix that you're so familiar with him already?" He slowly approached, his eyes full of ruthlessness. "If I had known you were such a slut, I wouldn't have bothered to hold back. I didn't even get you into bed for 100,000 yuan. What a loss." I was stunned, and all kinds of emotions surged up in that instant. Seeing that I was stunned, Cassius seemed to regain some of his sanity, opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something but finally said nothing. Silence spread between him and me. I raised my eyes, hiding my emotions well. I took out a notebook from my bag. It recorded every sum of money Cassius had given me over the past 3 years, totaling 106,250 yuan in bits and pieces. I wrote an IOU and handed it to him. "This is the money you've spent on me in the past 3 years. I've already signed it. You just need to sign it too." I stuffed it into his arms and didn't talk to him anymore. Taking advantage of the moment when he was stunned, I turned around and walked away. After taking a few steps, I turned around and said softly to him, "Being together with you was a mistake. Starting from tomorrow, this mistake will no longer exist." I walked quickly. Cassius had just come to his senses and called my name, "Serafina." He sounded urgent and flustered. However, people don't always move forward without hesitation. The relationship between Cassius and me had come to an end. Once I paid back Cassius's money, we would owe each other nothing. When I was packing my things, my fingers also became a bit stiff. Maybe I should go and see a doctor. I sent a message to my parents, asking them not to worry about me. Then, I broke my previous SIM card in half and threw it into the trash can. My WeChat was full of messages from Cassius. He asked me what I meant by my last sentence and wanted to meet me tomorrow. I didn't reply, nor did I delete him as a friend. Instead, I simply logged out of WeChat, then I applied for a new WeChat account with the new SIM card. After a while, a friend request message came through. The verification message had only 3 words, Phoenix. After adding him, he sent me tomorrow's itinerary. The flight was at a little after 6 o'clock. Fine, it would be quieter once I left. Come to the school gate tomorrow. I'll give you a ride, Phoenix sent another message. No need. I'll go by myself. Phoenix didn't reply again. The next day, I woke up the dormitory supervisor at a little after 4 o'clock. The dormitory supervisor always had a sour face when she saw me and said sarcastically, "Students should study hard." Hearing this, I stopped in my tracks, neither impatient nor angry. I turned my head to look at the dormitory supervisor and said, "The dormitory supervisor should also take good care of the dormitory building." After saying that, I closed the door. The dormitory supervisor's face turned blue and purple. When I arrived at the school gate, I took out my phone to hail a taxi. Someone snatched my phone away with one hand. "I'll give you a ride." When we arrived at the airport, Phoenix had a complicated look on his face. "Serafina, if you can't bear to leave Cassius, it's still not too late to reject me now." I looked at him and smiled. "I'm tired. I'm going to pursue my future now." On the day I left, there was the heaviest snowfall ever. In other people's eyes, snow might represent romance. But in my eyes, snow means getting cold, and I don't like it. When I arrived at the new place, I passed the interview and entered that company. Then I went to see a doctor. The doctor said that since I was young, as long as I exercised every day, I could slow down the progress of my illness. Maybe I could live for another 10 or so years. 10 years? It's enough for me to earn enough money for my parents. Half a year after entering the company, my monthly salary increased from 15,000 yuan to 20,000 yuan. I got an extra 50,000 yuan for working overtime during the Chinese New Year. In this half year, I saved up enough money to pay back Cassius. I transferred the money to Phoenix. He asked me if I had any other messages to convey. I thought about it and replied, no. Although I usually exercise, there are still places on my body that suddenly become stiff from time to time, but it only lasts for a moment. To prevent muscle atrophy, I got a gym membership and learned dance and yoga. Who would want to die early if they could live longer? Phoenix sent me messages every day, but they were all just ordinary greetings. Until 2 months before my graduation, he asked me, "Serafina, do you want to know how Cassius is doing now?" Mentioning Cassius, it felt as if a century had passed. Before I could reply, he continued, "Astria will come to your company for an interview in a few days." After a pause, he sent another message. The interview slot was given by Cassius. I replied to him after finishing the last pose of yoga, "So, do I have to leave again?" At that moment, there was a knock on the door. I frowned slightly. I didn't have any close friends in the company, and I didn't know anyone here. Who could it be knocking on the door so late? Looking through the peephole, I saw a familiar wild and unrestrained face. However, he was wearing gold-rimmed glasses, which forcibly suppressed the wildness in Phoenix's eyes. I opened the door. "Phoenix." Phoenix was dragging a suitcase, leaning against the door, his voice low. "You don't have to leave, but you might have to put me up for a while." I nodded silently. "Aren't you going to ask me why?" There was nothing to ask. Astria had just arrived, and Phoenix came right after. It was obvious that I shook my head. "I don't want to know your business." Phoenix was stunned for a moment and then smiled. "What, are you afraid that I'll silence you?" I was squatting down to tidy up the yoga mat and asked casually, "When are you leaving?" Phoenix lay on the sofa in a swaggering manner, took off his glasses and looked at me, smiling and saying, "It depends on my mood." I took a deep breath. I thought I had good patience. Unexpectedly, a single sentence from Phoenix could challenge my patience. I walked over to him with a smile, looking down at him, and he also looked at me. The next second, I lifted my foot and stepped on his dangling foot. "Then please clean up the room yourself, Phoenix." Phoenix's face wrinkled up. "You're really cruel." I sighed. In the past half year, I had made full use of my time. I didn't get too close to the people in the company, nor did I offend them. I thought my life had finally become peaceful, but in the end, this peace was still going to be broken. As soon as I arrived at the company, a colleague stopped me and then dragged me into the bathroom. My relationship with her was a bit complicated too. Originally, she was quite hostile towards me. Later, I completed a task for her and let her overhear my conversation with the doctor, learning that I had ALS. Immediately, her maternal instincts kicked in. Whoever in the company spoke ill of me, she would sarcastically mock that person. She said furiously, "I heard from the HR department that they will recruit someone to take your position recently. That person is from the same school as you, and I heard that she has some powerful backers. Your abilities are obvious to all of us. Why should she take your position right after joining the company? Replace me. Then let her do it." I lowered my eyes. She looked at me with a look of exasperation. "Can't you be a bit more assertive? Just challenge her. Our company isn't the kind that only values connections. If you're highly capable, they will surely keep you." I was just about to say something when I was called away by the HR department. It was pretty much what she had said. However, it wasn't that they were going to fire me, but that they wanted me to work for Astria. After working here for half a year, I was back to being an intern who served tea, poured water, and wrote documents. It seemed that Phoenix hadn't told me the truth. This wasn't an interview quota but a guaranteed admission quota. On her first day at work, Astria saw me and pointed at me as if she had seen a ghost. "Serafina." I ignored her and placed the documents and coffee on the table, saying, "Here are the documents that need to be processed today and the situation of the funds rise and fall." Half a year had passed, and she was still so superior. "After such a long time, so you're here. Who helped you get in? Was it Phoenix or Cassius?" "No, it couldn't be Cassius, otherwise." Astria stopped halfway through her sentence and quickly glanced at me in a flustered manner, afraid that I would ask about what came after "otherwise." But I didn't have the time for that. Interns are the busiest, with a lot of miscellaneous tasks. However, after working for so long, I was quite proficient at it. When I was getting documents for her, she whispered in my ear, "Serafina, cherish your time in the company. Do you know who the chairman of this company is? It's Cassius's uncle." I glanced at her and smiled. "Astria, be more mature. Instead of competing with me in a catty way, you should develop the abilities that match this position." Astria snorted coldly, "Let's wait and see." During the lunch break, Astria went to the HR department, but obviously, the HR department didn't agree to her request. So when she came back, her face was quite embarrassed. My good colleague sneered for a long time and then patted me. "People like her are full of devious thoughts. Don't pay attention to her." The plot twist came 3 days later, the day after I saw Cassius. Phoenix went to the central hospital and was so busy that his days and nights were reversed. Coincidentally, there was no food in the fridge, so I went out to buy groceries. When passing by a Western restaurant, I saw Astria and Cassius. The two were having a meal together. I stopped for a long time, remembering the time when I had a meal with Cassius in a Western restaurant. It was both embarrassing and happy. The way they used the knife and fork was extremely standard, and even Astria looked like a young lady. I came back to my senses and walked past them, but my steps were unusually fast. I wasn't sure if it was my illusion, but I seemed to hear a familiar "Serafina." When I got home, I suddenly missed my parents. I rarely cried usually, but today the tears just wouldn't stop falling. When Phoenix came back, he saw me crying while holding a bowl of tomato and egg noodles. "What, are the noodles that delicious?" Immediately, he took a pair of chopsticks and picked up a few strands of noodles from my bowl, took a couple of bites. "Tsk, they're really good." I got anxious, and the tears flowed even more freely. That's my noodles." Phoenix crouched down, stretched out his hands and slowly wiped away the tears on my face. "Did you see Cassius?" I nodded and pushed his hands away. "Phoenix, I no longer have any value to exchange with you. You don't need to coddle me like this anymore." I didn't say the rest of the sentence, saying it would be embarrassing for both of us. But Phoenix obviously understood. Phoenix sat on the carpet and lit a cigarette. Do you know everything? Yes, I said softly. In my senior year of high school, I was almost killed by my brother's men outside. Do you know who contacted my brother? Why was he suddenly asking this? I looked confused but still shook my head. Phoenix exhaled a puff of smoke, his voice a bit hoarse. Cassius. My best buddy in high school. I was stunned. I never expected Phoenix to tell me this. Why are you telling me this? Phoenix glanced at me. Don't you know that I asked you to leave to target Cassius? Target Cassius? Wasn't it for Astrea? Then what about you and Astrea? Phoenix smiled. We weren't very familiar originally. But Cassius liked her so much that he couldn't wait for my family to know about my existence and take me back because of her. But how could he know that it would cost me my life? I gathered all my emotions and said softly, then you've got the wrong person. To Cassius, I'm just someone he despises. Without me, he'd be happier. You've done a good deed by repaying his bad treatment with kindness. Someone he despises? Phoenix leaned lazily on the sofa. You really don't have a clear understanding of yourself. But I think I have a clear understanding of myself. Early in the morning, I was notified by the HR department that I didn't need to come to work anymore. Astrea looked at me with a smile. Why were you fired? She slowly walked towards me. You saw Cassius yesterday, right? I just said that I wanted to change my assistant, and he changed it for me, even if it was you who had been with him before. I thought my heart would be greatly agitated, but now I was quite calm. Move aside. You're blocking me from packing my things. Exactly. My good colleague pushed Astrea away with a bump, grabbed my hand while crying woohoo. What if there are tasks that we can't complete after you leave? Hearing this, the others, perhaps also thinking of that headache-inducing scenario, all gathered around. Astrea put on a different face, smiling and said, I'll work hard to lead everyone. I won't be worse than Serafina. Everyone, just relax. But everyone just listened. In the company, people have always been judged by their abilities. For them, a college student like Astrea who got such a high position without experiencing any major events has no persuasiveness at all. I packed my luggage, bowed to everyone, and smiled. Thank you all for taking care of me during this half year. I didn't look embarrassed at all when I walked out with the cardboard box in my arms. If this path doesn't work, then I'll take another one. Am I going to starve to death? As soon as I got downstairs, I greeted the security guard and was about to leave when I bumped into Cassius head-on. The bag in his hand was Astrea's. Cassius stood there in a daze, muttering, Serafina? I hadn't seen Cassius for half a year, and he seemed to have lost a lot of weight. I pretended not to see him and walked past him. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his voice trembling slightly. Have you been here all this half year? I looked at him and took a small step back. My retreating movement made Cassius freeze. He took out his phone and opened the chat records with me. All green on his side. I sent you messages every day. Do you know how I've spent this half year? Are you blaming me? I didn't answer him. Instead, I asked, did you receive all the money I paid you back? Cassius held my shoulders with both hands and turned me to face him directly. Serafina, I don't want your money. I want the you who was wholeheartedly devoted to me before. Huh? But Cassius, you yourself destroyed that me, didn't you? I forced a smile. Why do you think people won't change? Get out of the way. Cassius's expression froze for a moment, and he closed his eyes in pain. The next second, when he opened his eyes, there was a pleading look in them. Serafina, give me a chance? I've been everywhere to look for you during this half year, including your parents' house. You seem to have vanished from the face of the earth, disappearing without a trace from my side. I also had the thought of giving up the search, but you were always on my mind whether I opened or closed my eyes. Serafina, I've fallen in love with you. I can't live without you. He said he loved me, and I was stunned. I looked up into Cassius's eyes and sneered. Cassius, if it were half a year ago, I might have been overjoyed, but look at me now. Am I happy? Cassius tried to find surprise and happiness on my face, but he failed. His lips were as white as paper, which was a sign of extreme panic. I had just walked a few steps when Cassius looked at my cardboard box and asked, "It's working hours. Where are you going?" I stopped and turned to look at him, saying softly, "Thanks to you, I'm the little assistant who was asked to leave by you." "How could it be?" Cassius looked astonished, his tone certain. But it was the truth. I ignored him and walked outside. "How could it be?" Cassius looked astonished, his tone certain. But it was the truth. I ignored him and walked outside. He was waiting outside the company. When he saw Cassius chasing after me, he gave a tug. Then he casually put one of his hands on my shoulder, shielding me in his arms. "Phoenix." Cassius clenched his fists. Phoenix was still smiling. "After all these years, your feelings for Astria are still the same. Let Astria see how glorious it is to have the nephew of the chairman personally deliver a bag. I, a cast-out illegitimate child, can't compare to you." Cassius grabbed the bag, looking panicked. "Serafina, it's not like that. Listen to me explain." I buried my face in Phoenix's chest and said in a muffled voice, "Let's go, Phoenix." After getting in the car, Cassius stood dejectedly by the roadside. Phoenix glanced at me. "I'm okay." After a moment of silence, he said, "I just found out that you were fired." I leaned back in the seat and said, "Anyway, I've paid back everything I owed, and there's still some money left to treat my dad's illness. Now I should go home and see my dad. Mom said that Dad's illness is almost cured. After going home to see them, I'll look for a job again after getting my graduation certificate." I turned my head to look at Phoenix. His expression was gentle. "Then take a rest. I'll go back with you." When going home with Phoenix, he said that since we could be considered partners, it was only reasonable and proper for us to buy some things and go home to see my parents. I didn't stop him. I bought a lot of things, but when I got home, no one opened the door. I left in such a hurry that I forgot to take the house keys with me, so I just waited outside the door. Dad just recovered from a serious illness and needs rest. Where did they go? It wasn't until noon when the neighbor, who was back from buying groceries, saw me and was quite surprised. She said, "Girl, why are you only coming back now? Didn't your dad pass away yesterday? Probably he's already been sent to the crematorium by now." "What?" My hands went limp, and I almost collapsed. Phoenix held me in his arms. "Serafina, did I hear that right?" I looked at Phoenix, tears already filling my eyes. Phoenix nodded silently. "Then why did Mom say that Dad was cured?" Overwhelming grief engulfed me, and I propped myself up. I want to go to the crematorium. At least I can see him one last time." Phoenix drove very fast all the way. I searched everywhere in the crematorium until I saw my mom, who looked dispirited. "Mom." Mom turned around, and I hugged her tightly. "When did Dad become critical?" "The day before yesterday." Mom stroked my face, trembling as she said, "Before your dad left, he said that you were busy now and he didn't want to trouble you." I broke down crying. "Mom, do you know how painful it is for me not to see Dad one last time? Has Dad been cremated?" Mom shook her head. "Not yet. I got to see Dad one last time instead of just a cold tombstone. He had his eyes closed and looked peaceful." I trembled as I held his hand. "Dad, remember the rabbit charm for the next life, okay?" Phoenix was about to come forward to comfort me, but when he saw my dad, he froze. "Mom and I took care of all the funeral arrangements for Dad." I told Mom, "Dad said you're still young and he hoped you could find a new husband who would love and cherish you." "I have the same attitude as Dad. I'll save up a lot of money for you." Mom pinched my nose and said, "I'm old and don't have any skills. You should use the money you earn for your dowry. Why give it to me?" I shook my head and just smiled without saying a word. Phoenix frowned slightly. I don't know if he understood the implication of my words. Just in these 10 or so days, the company offered to raise my salary and hoped I would come back. It was still the same position as before. Who would turn down money? Phoenix and I set off to go home. He pointed at the old silver rabbit charm and said, "This silver charm saved my life. I've always hung it in my car. But this charm isn't mine. Now that I've found its owner, guess who it is?" I actually had a guess, but I still shook my head. Phoenix reached out, took down the charm, and put it around my neck. It's you. My dad didn't break his promise. No matter what the process was, I only knew that Dad had always remembered that. I held the rabbit charm and smiled from the bottom of my heart. Phoenix, thank you. Phoenix looked at me for a long time, as if he had something to say, but in the end, he still didn't say anything. When we got back to the company, the happiest one was my sarcastic good colleague. My good colleague had been almost buried under a pile of documents recently. She complained to me that Astria can't do anything right. These documents are piled up like a mountain, and there are a whole bunch of funds and securities to analyze. While she was talking, Astria had already come to my desk and spoke loudly. Serafina, you're so shameless. When you were in college, you were fawning over Cassius, but Cassius liked me. I thought you had given up. What? Are you going to start your fawning skills again? After saying that, she slapped me. I tried to block it with my hand, but my hand wouldn't listen to me. The loud slap echoed throughout the entire office. Why didn't she block it? Is she guilty? I heard someone whispering. It's so hard to say that I have a myotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. It is. I don't want to use my vulnerable position to suppress others, but I definitely won't allow others to bully me either. After my hand regained its feeling, I raised it with difficulty. My good colleague slammed the table, shielded me behind her, and with a shove, pushed Astria straight to the ground. How dare you push me? I just pushed you. So what? Why are you taking your anger out on Serafina? Could it be that your good suitor now likes Serafina? Astria's face turned red and then pale. Did I really hit the nail on the head? Go find that man if you have the guts. What kind of ability is it to bully Serafina? You're so shameless. My good colleague went on a tirade, and Astria, this newbie who had just entered society, was directly reduced to tears and then ran out in shame. She patted my hand and asked softly, "Are you okay?" I shook my head and smiled at her. "You're quite a fighter." "That's right." She looked extremely proud. "Serafina, the chairman wants to see you." The chairman? My good colleague and I exchanged a glance. For the first time, I took the chairman's special elevator to the chairman's office. When I got there, I didn't see the chairman but Cassius instead. He saw my left cheek, which was red from the slap, and reached out his hand. I still took a step back. "I just want to put some medicine on it," I said calmly. "No need for medicine. I'm not that delicate." Then there was another silence. Cassius suddenly hugged me, his voice trembling. "Serafina, what can I do to win you back?" Cassius's embrace still had a youthful air, which was the embrace I had longed for most back then. Now, it didn't make me feel as secure as Phoenix's embrace. I gave up struggling and said softly, "Cassius, you say you love me. I have a request now. Can you do it?" Cassius's eyes lit up, and he said excitedly, "Tell me." "I can definitely do it." I pushed him away, looking cold and speaking calmly. "When we were in the hospital, you asked me to pay Astria's medical bills. Did you know that I was diagnosed with ALS at that time? I don't have many years left to live. My request is that I hope you won't appear in front of me in the future. Don't come to burn paper for me after I die. Just pretend that I never existed." Cassius's blood rushed to his head, and a trace of blood even seeped from the corner of his mouth. I didn't know. He slumped on the sofa like a lost soul and then punched himself hard, again and again. He kept murmuring, "Serafina. I'm sorry." Looking at Cassius like this, it seemed that he was somewhat sincere. But I wouldn't turn back because of this bit of sincerity. When I got home, Phoenix was sitting on the sofa. He didn't turn on the light, hiding all his expressions in the darkness. "Why don't you turn on the light?" When I was fumbling for the light switch, Phoenix lit a cigarette and exhaled a puff of smoke. He said, "Serafina, have you seen a doctor?" I was slightly stunned, and then I understood what he was referring to. I replied softly, "The doctor said that in the best case scenario, I could live for another 10 or so years. Phoenix's voice sounded a bit repressed. "So you're saving money for your mom so that she won't be bullied, right? Have you thought about yourself?" I also sat in the dark opposite Phoenix. He was the only person I wanted to confide in. I thought for a moment and said, I'll arrange the best funeral for myself. And then pray that I can have an easier life in the next life. Phoenix suddenly stood up and sat next to me. Then you can just hire me. Aren't we the best partners? I can take care of you. After you die, I can definitely make your funeral the best. Then I'll pray with you that you can have an easier life in the next life and meet me, such a good partner, earlier. Phoenix would probably be sad after I die. But it's okay to be a bit selfish. So I nodded and reached out my hand to him. Happy cooperation. Later, Cassius really never showed up in front of me again. But I could always feel his intense gaze as if he was torturing himself. It was especially strong when I was with Phoenix. My good colleague also protected me, and Astrea seemed to have become a clown. Life was getting better and better. But the disease was getting worse and worse. Sometimes my hands and feet would lose all feeling. At those times, Phoenix would feed me by hand. The area of numbness was getting larger and the time was getting longer. I saw anxiety in Phoenix's eyes. I smiled at him and said, Dr. Phoenix has taken good care of me. But he eventually lost that fearless, unruly look he had before. My colleagues were all waiting for Phoenix and me to get married. But only I knew that Phoenix and I wouldn't get married. I had once asked Phoenix to break the contract, but Phoenix, who seemed shrewd but was actually stubborn, he said he wanted me to remember to find him earlier in the next life. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Most of my body had completely lost feeling. Phoenix, as usual, crouched down to comb my hair. This head of beautiful hair was really nice. Phoenix had become more mature, the type of uncle that girls like nowadays. But the worry in his eyes was getting deeper and deeper. Phoenix, will you forget me? Phoenix was silent for a while. Familiarly, he took out a lighter from his pocket. He lit it but didn't smoke. Phoenix actually had a big smoking addiction, but he quit because he was afraid my body couldn't tolerate secondhand smoke. When he spoke, his voice was a bit choked. No. I wrote a letter to Mom and also to my good colleague. What about mine? You'll find it. Because starting 5 years ago, I would write something for Phoenix every day, even if it was just sharing something. And our photos were all stored in his USB drive. Immediately after, I asked Phoenix to lower his head and kissed him on the corner of his mouth. I smiled and said, Phoenix, see you in the next life. Phoenix held my hand tightly. Serafina, I love you.